Hello, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 89, The Flute on Its Feet with Zara Lawler. Today's sponsor is brought to you by J&K Productions. Did you know that not only are they a production company for podcasts, but they are a recording company for musicians? Any musical recording needs that you may have, J&K Productions can fulfill that need. They have all the necessary equipment and expertise to record your next flute recording for college or graduate auditions, competitions, summer festivals, or a flute album. J&K Productions can record any setup imaginable, from solo flute, small chamber, flute and piano, and much more. Consider J&K Productions for your next recording project. Contact them at jkproductions.media. Hello everyone, welcome to the Flute 360 podcast. Today, my special guest is Zara Lawler, who is an interdisciplinary performer through the Flute on Its Feet. We will discuss Zara's career, but also how we as musicians can integrate movement within our bodies to express our musical intentions through our instruments. Welcome, Zara.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I so appreciate your time, and I can't wait to pick your brain so that way, myself included, but also the listeners, we can all benefit from your expertise.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yay! Sunday's discussion was really fun.
It was so fun. I feel I actually went and was teaching yesterday, and I was like, I won't exactly say stealing everybody's ideas, but inspired by a lot of what people were saying, just found it sort of finding its way into the teaching.
That's awesome. Yeah, same here. I was practicing for a lesson here in Greece, and I thought, oh my gosh, Monday, here I am practicing for my Tuesday lesson, and I thought, I can't wait to have a full week with these ideas, to let it sink in and for me to play with it,
Yeah. I knew Emma before, and so I've seen her in action and seen some Dalcroze stuff in action. It was so interesting to hear from Kathy some more about how she uses movement, because I had a little awareness of the Numo Pro in some of her teaching, but not very much. So it was kind of cool to hear about, about how she's incorporated that into her whole teaching, which seems like such an incredibly thorough approach.
Mm. Yeah, very holistic.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, same. I mean, I interviewed her for her Numo Pro when I was talking with inventors. And her, the background and the designs of the Numo Pro and the evolution it went through, it is so astounding. And when we were done, she goes, Heidi, we need to do something on KinderFlute. And I kid you not, that was over a year ago. So full circle, here we are. And I think it was beautiful how it fit into this whole flute and movement segment rather than KinderFlute being separate. I think it has more of a dynamic within this context. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll look forward to hearing that episode too.
Yeah. So for the listeners who are thinking, what group discussion are they talking about? There was a slew of wonderful, intelligent women that got together a couple days ago, and we recorded episode 91. So that comes out at the end of November. So speaking of expertise and all of that, let's talk about your field and what you do so well. So can you please share with the listeners who you are and your musical background?
Yeah, my name is Zara Lawler. I'm a flutist and an interdisciplinary performer. So in my performances, I combine music with theater, dance, story, poetry, and in as highly integrated a way as I can. So I dance and play at the same time, or I weave story or poetry into the music. Often I perform from memory so that I can move and act while I'm playing. And I do that on sort of a small scale. So like, maybe create a choreographed version of a short solo piece, or on a big scale where it's an entire evening length performance that is completely choreographed and or staged. And I also do that I do it as a solo project that's called the Flute on Its Feet. And the Flute on Its Feet isn't actually completely by myself. I'm usually the only musician playing, but I work a lot with the choreographer and dancer named Neil Parsons, who flutists might also know as a member of the Fourth Wall Ensemble. And I have a duo with a percussionist, Paul Fadoul, and the duo is called Lawler and Fadoul. And we do, sort of standard chamber music recitals. We also do theatrical performances, and we do a lot of performing for kids. And our performing for kids is highly movement and theater integrated as well. And then the sort of other big context in which I do this kind of performing is in putting together massed flute events. So I created a work called E Pluribus Flutum, which is a work for up to 60 dancing flutists at a time. I organized a flute jamboree for the National Flute Association's annual convention when it was in Washington, D.C. in 2015, and, put on big events like that. We also did the U.S. premiere of Sciarrino's Il Cerchio Tagliate dei Suoni, which is a piece for 4 soloists and 100 moving flutists, which we did at the Guggenheim Museum. So, bringing this kind of performance to a bigger group of performances and bigger audiences is another thing that I do. And just a word about my musical background. I, went to music school. I have my master's degree from Juilliard. I started out with a more traditional background. I had an orchestra job in the Hong Kong Philharmonic for a few years and freelanced in New York before going on this more wacky path.
So I don't think it's wacky, but I know what you mean. So how did you get on this wacky path? What made you decide to leave the orchestra and the more traditional career?
I've just always had bigger interests than just music. And I've always loved being part of something bigger and being part of something that has a sort of sense of spectacle. I loved when I was in music school being part of the opera and being in the pit and knowing that this other huge thing was going on at the same time. And I actually left the Hong Kong Philharmonic with the intention of creating a chamber music group that would do some kind of interdisciplinary performance, which I did for a couple of years on a small scale in New York. And then while that was happening, I got a call about a job in a company called Tails and Scales, which was a national touring ensemble that did new music and new theater for children and family audiences. And it sounded like something that was like right up my alley. So I took the audition, and at the audition, they performed for me a little excerpt of one of their pieces. And I was like, oh, this is what I've been aiming toward all this time. They were doing stuff that I had envisioned and yet doing it better and more than I had envisioned. And I was like, okay, sign me up. So I ended up playing with Tails and Scales for 8 years. And in that time, Tails and Scales, we would commission or sort of recreate a new work every year. And for us, a work was a 35 to 55 minute performance piece that usually told a single story, was performed completely from memory so that we could move and act while we played. And in a way, it was like opera for kids, except that we used our instruments instead of our voices to create the music. So it was a quartet. Neil Parsons, who is now, and Paul Fadoul, who are both my main collaborators, were both in that ensemble at different times. And in fact, all the other members of the Fourth Wall Ensemble, who you've probably heard of, were all members of Tails and Scales. A lot of people who are doing this interdisciplinary work have a connection somehow to Tails and Scales, because it was an incredibly deep way of doing that work and developing some expertise. And then, at some point, there became a time when it was time for me to move on, and I was ready to do it in a way that wasn't just for kids, and wanted to do some more solo stuff. So that's what I've been doing ever since.
Wow, how fascinating. Yeah, and it's neat how life unfolds, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something that, we were talking about this a little bit on Sunday, that it's become, music and movement has become a movement. And certainly when I got started on it in the late 90s and then early 2000s, it was like, it really did feel like a wacky path. And Tails and Scales was a really incredible way to get deeply into that, and honestly to do, to be able to do it full time, instead of just like, oh, wouldn't this be a nifty experiment? It was like, oh, we are committed to this way of performing. So, and I certainly, even 5 years before that would never have guessed that such a thing even existed.
Yeah. So in the short amount of time that I have talked with you, I feel like you are an extremely humble person. So when I asked this question, I asked that you try to be as objective as possible. Do you feel like you are paving the path for future interdisciplinary flutists?
Oh, gosh, I hope so.
Okay.
I really do hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. It's something that I've thought a little bit more about now than I used to think. I mean, probably just because I'm getting older, but I've been I offer a class in interdisciplinary performance at Manhattan School of Music Precollege, where I teach. And that feels really exciting for me, this opportunity to pass on some of the skills that I've developed. And it's not even so much skills, because I think one of the things that's tricky about this idea of sort of paving a way for future interdisciplinary flutists is it's a career of invention. And so it's not so much like, oh, this is how you play the flute while doing these particular moves. Yeah. It's more a mindset and a creative stance from which to do productive work. And so it's been interesting and exciting for me to have the opportunity to offer it to a kind of younger generation. For sure.
So like your approach, like the knowledge that you've learned just about like the creative process and your approach to the choreography, music, movements, that's something that you're finding that you're passing along?
Yeah. I mean, and I will say I am doing a project that might be more concrete than that, which is a set of Études for moving and speaking flutists.
Oh, neat.
I've choreographed 3 of the Andersen Opus 33 Études. And at the moment, I only have a slightly crappy video of them. So it's not something I can easily teach. Well, I shouldn't say that. I haven't had the opportunity to teach it in person, and the video is not a super useful tool just yet. But I would like to create a set of Études that would help people, I think because there are sort of two ways to approach it. One is to invent something yourself, and another is to learn something that somebody else has already invented. And I think both are totally valid ways of getting into the work. So hopefully, eventually, these Études would serve that purpose of being a sort of entree and teaching tool for people who are interested in trying, moving, and playing at the same time.
Oh my gosh, how neat.
Yeah. So we'll see. It's a sort of ongoing slow burn kind of a project.
Well, when the project comes to full fruition, please let me know, and I will update your post on my website and put up an announcement saying Andersen Études movement ready by the amazing Miss Lawler. So because that's exciting, and I'm pumped for you. And yeah, life is consuming, and those projects take on its own form, and you want it to be a good production, and I get that. Yeah. Cool. So you mentioned Neil, who is a choreographer. Now, does he choreograph all of your dances, or are you in collaboration with him? Like, how does that work?
He has choreographed very many of the pieces that I have done. There are a couple of pieces that I have choreographed by myself, like the Études and E Pluribus Flutum. There are pieces that Neil has choreographed for me where, we maybe decide on a piece of music to work on together, and I maybe give him a couple of ideas that I already have, and then, he comes back and says, okay, this is how it's going to go. And then there are other pieces that we've done that have been more collaborative. The Time Frame, which is our version of the Berio Sequenza, for sure, I list him as the choreographer in programs, but it emerged from a very collaborative process where, we had conversations about it, and then we went into the studio and did a whole pile of experiments, and I thought some things were cool and he thought some things were cool, and we sort of strung it together into a narrative that worked. And, often when I'm working with Neil or another choreographer, and I have worked with a few other people besides Neil as well, there's this part, and I actually, since I'm not a just plain old dancer, I don't know if this is how the way dancers work, but musician dancers, because we have to do this thing that it's almost by definition, the choreographer cannot execute what I am ultimately doing on stage, unless the choreographer is also a highly trained flutist. And, Neil is a highly trained musician, but even so, he can't play the Berio Sequenza on flute. So there is this sort of part of the job that is mine and can only be mine to do, if that makes sense. And certainly in the Berio, it was interesting. Neil and I worked together to come up with the various events that happen in the piece through experimentation and strung them together into a narrative order that made some sense. And then the sort of specifics of where things happened in the music was often my purview, because, like there's some things like you can't do in certain parts of the music, or some things where it was just like, oh, this move is so cool and it reminds me of this part of the music. Do you think it would work here? So there is that sort of aspect of being an interdisciplinary performer that ultimately, does fall to you even when you're working with a choreographer. If that makes sense.
No, it does. So you do not have any formal dance training?
I have some dance training.
Okay.
I mean, not, compared to my flute training, my dance training is very amateurish. But probably compared to the average flutists, my dance training is more substantial. I mean, I've now been performing this way for 20 years, so that in itself is a form of training.
Okay. Well, yeah.
And I did a lot of folk dance, and in my 20s, I did a certain amount of jazz and modern dance in my teens, and gymnastics before then. So I do have a certain amount of training, and sports. I played volleyball and ran track, so I have a lot of skill with using my body. Even though, if I were to go to a dance class, I would definitely sign up for a beginner class. and I would have a hard time keeping up.
No, and I ask that just because if there is a flutist or a musician who is listening to this and they say, you know what, that really captivates me and I am so intrigued. I want them to have kind of a little bit, I know two people's paths are the same, but I want them to have some kind of idea of, your background and how you came about it. And like you said, just experience throughout the 20 years, that's training enough.
Like they say, I think it's a proverb, and maybe of African origin, that is, if you can walk, you can dance, and if you can talk, you can sing. I think we can all move, and training or no training, you can always experiment. And then if you discover through your experimentation that you want to be able to do more, then you can always get the training that you need.
Yes.
And certainly that's some of what I have done, when I first left Tails and Scales and started to do some more kind of involved solo stuff. I actually took dance classes somewhat regularly here in New York, and worked with one of those dance teachers on a couple of the solo pieces that had already been choreographed and that I'd already been performing, because I just needed some feedback on how to better maintain my balance in a few spots and how to better execute a turn in a few spots, just because those were technical things. Without training, I just couldn't figure out. But with even a little training, it was like, this is how dancers do that or whatever. It's just like playing the flute. There are some tricks that the more training you have, the more you learn.
Yes, definitely. So when you do work with Neil and you are working on the set and the dances and the movement, what inspires you to come up with a new movement dance idea?
That's a great question. Some of it is just like spontaneous stuff that happens in the moment, for sure. Often in the projects I've done with Neil, the music has come first. We're working with a pre-existing piece of music, and often there's some germ of an idea that has just come into play. For example, in time frame, the whole reason there's a frame is we were having I really wanted to do something with the Berio. And we were having an almost joking conversation about, how that piece is so, sort of loaded in the flute world. This whole question of, how do you interpret the notation? Do you do the first version that Berio published or the second version? Is there a right way? And we were making jokes about how it seemed like it was, we needed to reframe it somehow. And then we started talking about frames, and we actually went into the studio with a coat rack that could serve as a giant frame, and then a couple of picture frames that I had lying around the house of different sizes. And we were going to do all sorts of experiments with all these different frames. And the coat rack proved so fruitful that we never used any of the other frames. And that device itself of a frame kind of ended up setting the whole tone of the work, and everything else sort of flowed from that. So sometimes it'll be as simple as like a simple idea like that then becomes the germ of the whole piece.
Yeah, that really it's a full circle moment for me, because this Saturday, episode 86 goes out with Hilary Abigana. And in her interview, she says something very similar. I don't want to misquote her, so I will try to paraphrase the best way I can. But she said that no idea is too silly. And she's like, careful when you say, oh, yeah, haha, what if we did this? And then it ends up being that thing is the performance, or that thing is the prop or the movement. And so she said, I will never limit, never is a strong word, but I try not to limit that creative process, because the moment I think, oh, haha, we can't do that, it's going to be the thing. So, yeah.
Right. Can I add one other thing to that, which is that sometimes I do go into a project with sort of an agenda. So, for example, these Études that I'm working on, it's like, oh, I want people to experience. So one of them is basically, it's like a series of poses. So it's not continuous movement. It's a series of poses. So it's like an opportunity for you to just play the flute in different shapes.
Okay.
And then another one of them, I wanted people to, one of the things that's really challenging about playing the flute and moving is having your upper body feel free, because we use it to play the flute. And so we kind of want to keep it in its flute position. So another one of the Études is really a lot about finding ways to move the upper body while playing. So I think that, you can go into a project, with an open mind where you just try, you sort of try whatever crazy idea comes to you. And then you can also pretty successfully be like, okay, well, I want this to be about X, and then let X generate the work.
I love it. Yeah. So speaking of movement then, when you put together a presentation or performance through the Flute on Its Feet, what have you learned about your body while incorporating movement into your performances? And it could be related to maybe like the body and the flute, that relationship.
Well, one thing I've learned is that the way it feels is not the way it looks. Which, I think actually probably for many flutists, we eventually learn that the way it feels isn't necessarily how it sounds.
Yes.
And I think that is it's a body analog to that idea that I may think something feels really cool and really interesting, but without seeing it on video or in a mirror or getting a choreographer's feedback, I don't know if it's convincing. Just because it feels good and interesting doesn't necessarily mean it's something worth the audience watching.
I see.
That sounds very negative, but I actually mean it sort of more as a kind of learning process.
No,
yeah, I don't know if that's a great question.
No, okay. I learned something from that, and I think you said it very well. I think maybe what I'm hearing is, I remember a teacher telling me once, like, yes, Heidi, I mean, you've got great ideas. You're playing it well. You've got good phrases. The tone is great. That's great. Blah, blah, blah. And she's like, but you're not convincing me. She's like, you have to convince me. She's like, put your stamp of approval on and say, this is how it's going to be done. And you guys listen up, and not in a negative way, but like, you know, make that audience member sit up in their seat and say like, oh, you're taking charge and you're giving your interpretation and you're going for it. And, oh, I notice you. I don't know if that's along the path that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about, although I think I'm talking about it sort of in the opposite direction of not so much how the audience responds, but that in the process of creating the performance, it's not enough to just have the great idea. You also have to really physically manifest that idea in a way that the audience will hear and or see or kinesthetically respond to. Yeah, so it's not, you can't just sort of keep it in your head.
Yes. I'm probably not even relaying that very well on my side too, but I am saying like what you're saying. It's one thing to have it here in your head and your ears, but if you're not actually like really selling it or exaggerating it or showing the intent of it, then it's not going to come across.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. No, I get that. So how do you do that then?
You know, when it's something that I'm choreographing myself, I use video or just ask someone to come and watch it and tell me what they see. When I'm working with somebody else, I usually trust the other person to tell me if we're getting there. It was interesting, actually, this year I've been working on a project with a choreographer other than Neil. And it's been interesting because I think, you know, her name is Melissa Riker, and she is so used to working with dancers, you know, that when she choreographs something with her dancers, they can execute it pretty quickly. And so, you know, pretty well, pretty quickly. So she's able to adjust and assess her creative process in kind of real time. And it was interesting in working with her. And this was also a piece of music that was written for me and for this project by the composer Jessica Meyer. And so unlike, say, the Berio, where there were a million recordings out there that we could use as the basis of our work before I could play the Berio, we didn't, you know, it took me a while to learn the music to a point where I could play it expressively. And then there was this added thing of then learning to do the choreography and then learning to do first of all, creating the choreography with the choreographer, then learning to do the choreography that had been created, which, you know, for me as a non-trained dancer takes longer than it would for a trained dancer. And also takes longer because I am doing something else at the same time, because then there's that added layer of learning to do the expressive playing of music while doing this choreography. So it really, this project took a long, long time to develop. And there was a really interesting part in the process where we were getting close to a performance. And so we would work together for an hour or two. And then I would spend another hour or two in the studio learning what we had created in the first hour. And Melissa would hang around and not really participate in that process, but she was sort of present. And she said something like, oh, I really am learning a lot by just hearing and seeing how you work to learn to do this. Because I think at some points during the process, she was like, I don't know if this is going to come together, And then it was like, oh, there's this other layer of what has to happen, and I think that's a big thing for people who are interested in trying out or creating an interdisciplinary performance. Honestly, it's just that it takes way more time than just playing a piece.
Oh, yeah.
The process takes so long because there are so many layers to it.
Oh.
And you just have to give yourself a lot of time for it to get to that point that it's at the level that you would expect your performance to be if it was just you standing there playing the flute.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, you say without a doubt, and yet it's a surprise to me every time. I'm like, oh my God, 3 years later, we're still working on this piece. Oh, right. It takes that long every time.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. So we've been talking about Sequenza. So let's talk about another project of yours, and that is Clickable, the Art of Persuasion. How did it come about? Who composed it? And where will you be performing this work in 2019 through 2020?
I'm very glad you asked me that question.
Yes. Yay.
Actually, Clickable is a project that I've been doing with my percussion partner, Paul Fadoul, with our duo, Lawler and Fadoul. And we really wanted to create an evening, like a concert length theatrical performance. And I had this idea for a long time that it would be really funny to do a performance that had live commercial breaks. I just loved jingles when I was a kid, and I just always thought that would just be a sort of funny way to set up a live performance. And so that was one sort of kernel of idea there. And then we had this idea, we were talking about it actually as a sort of Americana piece, and sort of what could be more American than a commercial jingle. Like that is a truly American art form that has been underrepresented on the concert stage, in my opinion. But then we actually were realizing at the time that we started this project, we had been doing a lot of performing in Canada, and we just thought, oh, it seems so exclusive to say, American. So we were looking for a way to still basically do the same project, but have it not be limited to the United States, and came up with this idea of the art of persuasion. So it's music and words of persuasion. So there are commercial jingles. There's also a lullaby, which is sort of persuading a baby to sleep. There's a serenade, persuading through music someone to fall in love with you. And then there are 3 pieces that are based on the dust jackets of books. So that blurb on the inside cover of a book that makes you want to buy the book. We created 3 pieces of music based on them. One is Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Another is a young adult novel called We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, and the music is by Ralph Farris. And the third is called Power, Money, Fame, Sex. It's by Gretchen Rubin. And it's like the actual subtitle of that book is Power, Money, Fame, Sex, a user's manual. And it is the dust jacket is really over the top. And it was really interesting because we ended up doing our premiere performances of Clickable. The first one was in Washington, D.C. about a week before Donald Trump was elected. And the second one was in New York about a week after Donald Trump was elected. And it was really, it was really interesting to look at this idea of persuasion in the context of that election and all the stuff that happened and the different ways people were persuaded to vote for the different candidates, without being too political. It has proved to be more timely than, we even thought when we started to create the project. And the piece ends, there's actually quite a bit of audience participation in it, as well as choreography and theatricality. And that was something that we were really excited to bring to a general, adult audience rather than just in our kids performing. So in We Were Liars, which is actually also a story that has political overtones, the audience sings along in 4-part harmony. in one of the pieces that's called Jingle Without Words by Lou Spratlin. The audience helps by creating various sound effects during the piece. And then the final number of the whole performance is a protest song by the singer-songwriter Pat Humphries called Common Thread. And it really, it really celebrates unity in diversity. And it's a sing-along, and we do it. Neither of us plays our quote-unquote real instruments. I played banjo, and Paul plays guitar, and the audience sings along with us on the chorus. And it's like this rousing communal end to, a kind of intellectual exploration of the whole idea of persuasion. It ends with this big communal moment of creating music together with the audience, celebrating sort of how we're all different and yet all can do this beautiful thing together. So that has been a really fun, another one of those projects that's taken way longer than we ever thought. We started talking about it in 2013. The premieres were in 2016, and it's coming out as an album in 2020. So that's a 7-year start to finish span.
Wow.
But, there are worse ways to spend time. So
this is true. But 7 is a very good number.
That's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like the number 7.
Good. It's coming out as an album in February. So there will be some album release events. There'll be one in New York and one in Washington, D.C. for sure. And then we're working on some other dates that hopefully will be announced soon. And we'll be performing it in upstate New York in the fall of 2020.
Awesome. Yeah. If there's anything I can do to help with your calendar of events with this project, feel free to let me know, and I'll keep posting as much as I can because I want people to check it out. It is really neat. And
sure.
I'm sure a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into it. I mean, especially 7 years. I mean, that's, you're really dedicated to it, and the whole team is dedicated to it. So we want people to be able to view it.
Yeah. Well, it would be, we have a video of Power, Money, Fame, Sex that'll be released soon. We're just finalizing the final rights to the text for that. And then everything should kind of come out. So I'll make sure that you get all that information.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So a lot of Flute 360 podcast listeners are educators. So let's dive a little bit into music education. And since you are an interdisciplinary performer, how has this aided your teaching? Like this niche that you do, this field that you do?
Mm-hmm. I think it's helped in both direct and indirect ways. I mean, certainly, I actually occasionally teach actually what I do. So I have this class at Manhattan School of Music Precollege called Chamber Music Plus, where I work with the students to create their own performance pieces, whether it's on flute or other instruments, of their own design. And use some of the methods I've used to kind of generate ideas and generate projects with them, on their own projects. I've had a couple of students who have wanted to learn, the pieces that I perform. So I have done that a couple of times of teaching a piece that I have done so that a student can, duplicate it like they would, if we were all just working on the Chaminade concertino or something. But I think also it's really just informed my approach in trying to really encourage students' own creativity, whether it's by actively using movement in as simple a form as just making a gesture with my arm, or encouraging a student to do the same to capture a sense of the music, or, more actively using movement as a way for them to feel rhythm and feel meter and, feel changes in tempo by feeling how it changes their body to move faster or slower. I think it's had kind of a big impact, although I will say sometimes I find myself, people ask me that question quite a lot. And sometimes I feel like, I do it less than you might think, because there are also just regular old flute playing things that kids need to learn. And sometimes just playing the flute is the best way to learn it.
Just do your scales and your tone. I mean,
exactly. Yeah. Come on, just keep working.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I'm going to throw out a little teaser to the listeners. Sunday's discussion, Zara talked about a specific exercise, I guess you'll call it, that she used to help a student with tempo changes. So my little teaser is check out episode 91 to hear her activity that she did with her student. So yeah, it's always good to get them wanting more.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot. So like in a traditional, you've already mentioned this a little bit. In a traditional like flute lesson, yes, tone, tongue, fingers, all that jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess we don't have to really dive into this because maybe the teaser alone will be how you incorporate movement like in a traditional flute lesson, not necessarily working on a specific project, through your class. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that we did talk a lot about that on Sunday, but I do think that, I mean, especially, the place I use it the most is when a new student is learning about 6/8. There's something about 6/8 that's just like, when you look at it on the page, it just doesn't look like it sounds.
Huh.
And especially when you're learning to read music at the same time that you're learning to play your instrument, 6/8 just seems so complicated. It's like, it looks like it's in 6 and the math adds up to 6, but you feel it in 2, but the 2 is divided into 3. And, but I find that just like swaying with kids while we play something that's in 6/8 or, just swaying and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just a bunch of times is often enough to get them to feel it. And that's the kind of way I often find myself using movement in an individual lesson. It's just something pretty simple like that, but giving them access to it in their bodies, not just in an intellectual way.
Mm-hmm. Those darn compound meters.
I know. Yeah, or when you're in 5/8, even better, because then you can practice limping.
Yeah, exactly. That's the official dance move, limping.
Right. Yeah. Limping. Exactly.
Oh, I love it. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to share? It can be anything under the sun.
I just like to come back to the idea. I mean, even though we've been talking about how music and movement is a movement now, and, everyone's doing it and you can go to school for it and you can get training. I also just want to once again give a shout out to this idea that you really don't necessarily need to be trained to try something new and something that, we all, especially if you're being trained in a classical tradition, we all have this idea that we all have to be able to do everything on the flute equally well. We have to be able to play beautifully, forte and beautifully, pianissimo and double tongue and triple tongue, and play in this meter and that meter and do those techniques and this techniques. Because at any moment, Toscanini is going to say, you, flutist, bar 68, louder, and then you're going to play bar 68 louder. And he's going to be like, you, flutist, bar 113, softer. And you have to be ready to do it. And certainly that is great training. But when it comes to actually being an artist, or someone who is a performer, you don't have to play everything under the sun. You don't have to perform everything under the sun if it's you who's creating the performance. Now, if you are in an orchestra or in an ensemble where you are not making all the programming decisions, that's a different issue. But, when you're talking about creating your own solo performances or creating in a small ensemble with colleagues with whom you all are all in agreement, you can decide, like, I am going to do the things that make me sound the best. Mm-hmm. And when you are working with a choreographer, if they keep asking you to do something that doesn't look good when you do it, or it doesn't sound good when you do it, you can say to the choreographer, hey, you know what? I've been working on it for 5 months and I still can't, for example, like something that I cannot do is suddenly engage my abs in the middle of a beautiful soft note and have it still sound beautiful and soft. So, so that does not show it up in any of my choreographed works. So when you are creating something for yourself or you're working with someone to create something for you, if something in it turns out to be impossible, ask them to change it.
Yeah.
Or if you're creating yourself, change it so that what you're presenting on stage is only what you can do.
I love it. Awesome. So the last portion of the show, I do a segment called Picks. Do you have a pick for the listeners today?
You know what I was thinking about, since your listeners are educators, my pick would be Suzuki Flute.
Oh, great.
I am in the process of going through my own Suzuki training, and it has been an incredibly powerful tool for me in my teaching. And I would just highly encourage people to check it out. It's a wonderful way to teach kids and grownups because it's really more about how people learn than about what people are learning. So it's an incredibly strong way of teaching.
I love it. So my pick for today is What Every Musician Needs to Know About the Body by Barbara and Benjamin Conable. So if you want to check that out, it was a pick for today since we are talking about the body and movement and all of that great stuff. I just wanted to throw in a reference that brings it all together. Well, thank you so much for your time, energy, and expertise. And I so appreciate picking your brain and you being so open and honest about your creative process and the work you do. It is extremely exciting, and we so appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's been really, I love having this kind of conversation because I always find myself learning while we do it.
Yeah. I learn from all of my guests, like every time. I even did like an Instagram story and I said, seriously, guys, every episode, I feel like I just completed a 16-week collegiate course. I mean, it blows my mind. You never stop learning, and that's what makes it so exciting. The Greeks have taught me something here in the month that I have learned, and they say that eating creates an appetite. So I really like that. It's simple but true. Yeah. Well, you have a great day. I know your day is beginning. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and we will be in touch.
Great. Thanks so much, Heidi.
Do you love seeing children excited about learning music and playing the flute? KinderFlute classes are carefully designed to create a love of learning. During the teacher training classes, flute teachers learn how to integrate games and movement into their classes to both motivate and maximize learning potential. The movement activities and games are foundational to helping the students maintain a keen sense of alertness. Not only does KinderFlute motivate students, but also the teacher training classes has energized and transformed many studios. The ideas from the teacher training classes can be applied to students from ages 4 through 12. The next U.S. training class will be this summer, July 8th through the 11th, but it's not too early to sign up. The available spaces are limited, so it's best to sign up as early as possible. They will be held just north of Pittsburgh, and the housing is at the beautiful Eden Hall at Chatham University. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBigay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.